I love playing bad video games. To understand your favorite pieces of media, sometimes you have to understand the worst. There's something freeing about playing a bad game, something that's been so panned critically, the bar is so low. The opportunity is there to change the narrative and really shock you. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I've selected 8 of the worst reviewed games on the PS3. I selected these games from their Metacritic listings and found some of the ones with the lowest Metascores on the platform. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. I also have a Patreon in the description if you want to get access to extra content or just support the channel. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about bad games. Damnation is a third-person shooter developed by Blue Omega Entertainment. It was released on May 26, 2009 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 36 out of 100 on Metacritic. Damnation was the only game developed by Blue Omega Entertainment, who previously had released 2 horror films, 2005's Danica and 2006's Dark Ride. They then released Damnation 3 years later, and it was so unsuccessful that the studio was forced to shut down. Damnation is very odd in just about every single way. It was originally developed as a mod for Unreal Tournament 2004. It came in second place for the best total conversion mod, only beat out by Red Orchestra, developed by Tripwire Interactive. Damnation was then developed for consoles and delayed many times before release in 2009. The game itself takes place in an alternate US where the Civil War never ended and technology advanced along with the conflict. An inventor named Prescott developed steam robots and large machines that dominate the battlefield. His corporation, PSI, supplied arms to the government and eventually brought the war to an end. But Prescott has now decided to overthrow the current administration and take control of a new American empire. A lot of this information is inferred, and the game just sort of drops us into the conflict at the beginning. We control a character named Rourke, who heads a resistance movement against Prescott's new reign. Rourke shows up with 2 friends in the first mission, where we are tasked with taking out a nearby bridge and linking up with a support team. First of all, the writing and voice acting are both terrible in this game. Every single plot point is just straight up said directly to the viewer, instead of the characters making realistic, humanizing conversation between themselves.
Then your aim is poor, both with your words and your guns.
Be thankful I have not aimed them at you, yet. You are a hard woman.
Pain and death are hard.
We're quickly told that Rourke has a girlfriend in one of the most strangely paced cutscenes I've ever seen. The voice acting is stilted and wooden. Most characters in the game, save 1 or 2, speak like robots, and if this game were released today, I would be sure that it was generative AI. It makes everyone just a robotic archetype, a vague idea of a person with some actions attached, an abstraction of a character with loose features associated with them. Also, literally every Native American character in the game is like the stereotypical wise healer with magical powers. But despite how bad the cutscenes are in this game, the gameplay is even worse. For a game where the main mechanic is shooting, the gunplay is awful in Damnation. The shots from just about every gun do not feel powerful at all, possibly the worst shotgun I've ever used in a video game. Most of the weapons are incredibly inaccurate, and the enemies in the game do a ton of damage. Actually, moving around arenas freely and trying to get up close to groups is just a no-go, because you'll be dispensed by the enemy very quickly. So you essentially have to hang back and take out enemies from afar, which is not easy anyways. Even getting kills doesn't really feel good, mostly because of the weapon feedback. The ammo animations and the sound effects don't help either. Rather than a powerful weapon shot, it just sounds like a Nerf gun. The gameplay is the foundation of the entire game, considering that it's a shooter, so the fact that this is the most disappointing part of the game means that we're constantly fighting with a system that's supposed to be the selling point. Damnation also puts a ton of emphasis on its climbing system. Often in levels, to progress, we have to climb buildings, grab hold of railings, and jump to ladders to get to where we need to go. This takes up what I would say is about half of the time in Damnation. We spend half of the time slowly taking out enemies and then figuring out how to jump around and get to the next area of the game. While the climbing system does work, it gets very repetitive very quickly. The same two actions over and over again until we get to a cutscene and get transported to another area. The only sections of the entire game that I liked were the driving sections. You're actually allowed to drive on the walls and go fully horizontal, which makes for some intense set pieces. The game also isn't that strict with the driving sections, and the controls aren't that bad either, but they're pretty few and far between. The maps themselves are massive though, and I do commend the team on their ability to achieve scale with this world. Absolutely huge landscapes, though the aesthetics of those landscapes are pretty grim. Mostly copy and pasted broken down buildings with extremely bland textures that don't quite inspire imagination. Overall, Damnation is a strange attempt at creating a steampunk alternate history, one that, for the most part, doesn't work. It feels like a massive swing and a miss, and while the game may have been pretty good for an Unreal Tournament mod, it certainly doesn't work as a standalone video game. Rambo the video game is an on-the-rails shooter that was developed by Teon. It was released on April 29, 2014 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 34 out of 100 on Metacritic. Teon has developed a lot of different slop, many pieces of shovelware for a lot of different systems. Until recently, they were mainly known for this and their poor license titles. RoboCop Rogue City was a somewhat recent development and a shocking success for them. But before their success with the 80s film series, they developed another adaptation of an 80s film series, a direct adaptation of the first 3 Rambo films: First Blood, Rambo First Blood Part 2, and Rambo 3. In Rambo the video game, we play the titular character, fighting his way through Nam, fighting his way through local PD, and fighting his way through Nam again. All of this is translated through the lens of an on-the-rails shooter. Rambo will statically move through areas and stop for brief moments as we have to aim our cursor around the screen and fire at enemies. To reload our weapon, we have to complete a timing minigame. Match the button press in the white area and we get the full magazine. Outside of that, and we get 50%. Inside the yellow area, and we get 200%. It's actually a neat little mechanic and is pretty effective most of the time, though it's probably more punishing than it should be. Rambo also has a cover system that we can take advantage of. At certain points when Rambo stops to take fire at enemies, we can move the left stick and, depending on the cover that we have, we'll be able to get behind objects to avoid fire. This is, again, a pretty good system for an on-rails shooter. It's not something that I see appearing in too many on-rails shooters, especially from this time. But once again, it's also a bit too punishing. Don't use cover enough and you're going to get filled with bullet holes pretty quickly. Use it too much and someone is going to run up on you while you're reloading. We can also throw grenades and use a feature called Wrath Mode. The Wrath Mode bar fills up after a certain amount of kills and we can activate it. During Wrath Mode, time slows down and any kills that we get give us a bit of health in return. This is our main mechanic to get health back in the game. Each stage gives us a score, and this score is then applied to Rambo in experience. We get skill points for each level increase and can use those skill points to increase the different attributes of our character. We can increase toughness, damage with weapons, amount of grenades, and wrath bars that we have at our disposal. The game also features quick time events, normally for stealth sections or areas of the game where we have to dodge artillery. Now, on its face, I actually don't have a ton of issues with the gameplay of Rambo the video game. The mechanics themselves are fine and mostly functional as a standard on-rails shooter. There are some hiccups, like checkpoints being a bit too spread apart and quick time events taking up too much of the game. But that would be judging the game without perspective, because paying full price for this game on launch would have been a complete and total ripoff. First of all, the game is only a couple of hours long. If you're moderately good at it, you can beat it in 2. It feels more like an arcade game that was ported to consoles and just had all the coin-baiting features ripped out. On top of that, the polish on the game is very rough. The game follows the first 3 Rambo film stories, but it also just rips the audio straight from the films for all of the cutscenes.
We fire so many bullets in battle, we forget how important one single shot can be.
The developers didn't seem like they mixed any of that audio for the game, though, so all of the background music and everything is still playing behind it.
But Barry was long dead. Cancer, Agent Orange. Got himself killed in Nam. Didn't even know it.
It sounds so awful and makes the game feel super cheap, like an animated YouTube tribute to the Rambo movies instead of a video game adaptation. The game also looks awful, even for the PlayStation 3. Rambo himself looks absolutely cursed in some specific scenes, and his proportions are just way off. The whole thing looks and sounds very goofy. Even the stage completion screen has this awkward soundbite ripped straight from the films.
Mission accomplished.
It's also the only on-rails shooter that I've ever seen that lets you fire your finger at keypad buttons in the middle of a mission. Now, that's revolutionary. Stealth is a heavy mechanic at certain points, and some missions even let you choose between a stealthy or loud approach. When you're stealthing, though, you have to use both QuickTime events to take out enemies up close, and a bow, which is just very unwieldy. The bow has to be charged to shoot it, and it takes too long. It also just ends up being really finicky, like you can shoot enemies too early in their animation and it just doesn't hit. This causes instant death to Rambo. The game also tries to push heavy emphasis on not killing officers, because in the first game, Rambo has to fight against the local police. So if you do accidentally kill an officer, you get this wild pop-up that says "Cop Killer." The game does take some points away if you take the lives of people you're not supposed to, but it's not really that much. In general, there just isn't enough here to even facilitate a full game like this. Maybe a $10 project on Steam would be worth something like this, but not a full-priced console game. You might be able to squeeze some extra time out of the game with the extra challenges that you get from completing missions. Hell, you might even be able to grind out XP and get your Rambo to max level so you can unlock all of the skills, but none of the systems are really engaging enough to be worth dumping all of this time into in the first place. Family Guy: Back to the Multiverse is a third-person shooter developed by Heavy Iron Studios. It was released on November 20th, 2012 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 40 out of 100 on Metacritic. As far back as video games have existed, developers have been trying to make video game tie-ins, games that would serve as another way to craft stories and worlds created in other mediums. Also as a way to create another revenue stream for popular properties. Hell, Heavy Iron Studios got their start making Evil Dead: Hail to the King for the PS1 and Dreamcast. The last game they developed would be Pac-Man Mega Tunnel Battle for the Google Stadia. Not a great way to go out. Family Guy comes from this same legacy, a game that attempts to tap into the popularity of the animated comedy sitcom. It wouldn't even be the first game to attempt this, though. Tons of mobile and browser games had preceded Back to the Multiverse. Even Family Guy video game released on the Xbox and PS2. So, in just about every way possible, Family Guy: Back to the Multiverse is not an original idea. Its mechanics reflect this, its story reflects this, its very concept reflects this. Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to say that I don't like Family Guy. I don't know why, I've just never really enjoyed the show at all. It doesn't appeal to me, and I don't think it's very funny. The game seems to be even beneath the humor that the actual show presents, though. While I don't like the base show, I can recognize that the game's writing just isn't on the same par as the animated product. The main plot unfolds after Bertram, who Stewie had already killed, shows up in the house. He's come from another universe and is determined to assemble an army throughout the multiverse to take out Brian and Stewie. We then have to venture out into the multiverse, tons of different timelines that have altered reality from the real world. In each of these realities, we have a few objectives that we need to complete to stop Bertram's plans from being fulfilled. In the first reality, on a college campus, we need to defeat the jocks and help the nerds by getting them to pull off a successful party. In the second level, we face a group of violent Amish who have been bribed by Bertram with standard tree seeds. The plot itself is very repetitive and is essentially a very, very, very long episode of Family Guy, one narrative that's stretched out over the course of multiple hours. It just gets boring very quickly, so we have to rely on gameplay to quell that narrative interest. The gameplay itself is pretty damn boring, though. We can switch between Brian or Stewie at any time, each with distinct items for either of them. Brian generally has real guns, and Stewie has some sort of laser variety. In combat, we can throw out items that are also specific to each character. Brian has a Molotov cocktail, and Stewie has a dirty diaper. These weapons are basically grenades that have different effects. We can also collect a variety of other consumables as well, golden chicken eggs that summon the fighting chicken, and wacky, wavy, inflatable tube men that distract our foes. The combat in this game is dead easy. Most enemies are taken out in a few normal shots, and none of them really pose that much of a threat from a damage perspective. If they do get up close, we can take them out with melee attacks. Every kill gives us certain amounts of money, and we can also collect cash from around the environments. This money can then be used at portals and checkpoints to buy new weapons, upgrade our ammo capacity, and our health. It's a decent upgrade system, but you can pretty quickly max out your stats, and then the only thing really left is to buy costumes. Most of the mechanics and gameplay just feel like busy work. It feels like we're being led down a trail of bland breadcrumbs with no reward at the end. The level design is at times serviceable, and at other times downright awful. Repeated structures over and over that feel like they're meant to artificially extend the length of the game for monetary reasons. I struggle to really understand who this game was made for. It can't really be for fans of the TV show. I mean, the game doesn't provide anything that the show doesn't, and if it provides the same thing the show does, then it's just a lesser version of the original product. It's definitely not for people who don't know about or like Family Guy, because those people probably wouldn't buy the game in the first place. I can only imagine that the people that would want to play the game are those that were sort of hoodwinked into it. But that desire most likely disappears as soon as the consumption of the product begins. If the jokes aren't there, then the people that watch the show for the jokes aren't there. If the gameplay isn't there, then the people that want a good game aren't there. So who really is there?
Somebody, anybody, help! For the love of God, help!
Should we just pretend we're not hearing this?
Hearing what?
I like you today.
Kick-Ass the Game is a beat-em-up game developed by Frozen Codebase. It was released on April 29, 2010 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 33 out of 100 on Metacritic. In 2010, I was obsessed with Kick-Ass. In middle school at the time, I watched the movie over and over. I eventually found the comics and devoured those. Needless to say, I was excited to find out that there was a PSN downloadable game made for the Kick-Ass film, and even more disappointed when I realized it wasn't good. Kick-Ass, if you aren't aware, originally started out as a comic book. It was about a high school teen who becomes a vigilante superhero. He wears a mask and fights people to get some sense of control in the world, an adolescent expression of anger, fear, and rage. The film adaptation was relatively successful, bringing the comic to the big screen behind director Matthew Vaughn. These days, I can't say that I'm a huge fan of Kick-Ass. It's aged a little bit for me, but it still has a certain kind of charm. The lack of success in the game is not reliant, though, whatsoever on the quality of its predecessors. In Kick-Ass, we can play one of 3 characters. The only thing this really affects is how certain NPCs appear in the game, though, as their movesets are mostly identical. Each character has a light and heavy attack. There aren't really combos to do with these attacks, it's either just mashing one button or the other. We can also use special attacks with a special meter that fills up after a certain period of time. Combining the R2 button with one of the face buttons will pull off a unique ability like dashing towards an enemy, or in Hit Girl's case, vaulting over them in a hail of bullets. One of Kick-Ass's biggest sins is just how uninspiring it is. The game sees us taking out various mob affiliates all over the city. These missions usually play out in exactly the same way. Take out some groups of guys in different environments. Fight a mini-boss that basically just has more health than a regular enemy. Then take out more groups of goons in the same environments. And finally take out a boss which, if you're lucky, might have a special attack or two. This same wash and rinse cycle is repeated throughout most of the levels in the game. While beating up goons, we can collect experience and level up our character. We can increase one of 3 stats: health, attack, or special. I found attack the most useful because getting into a situation where we can't do enough damage almost surely means game over. But there's also not a lot of ways to forego damage in this game. There isn't a block or dodge button, so we just sort of have to eat any damage that the enemy doles out. You can kind of avoid some hits if you jump, but it's not always that accurate. This means that we definitely need some defense as well to make things work. The only interesting thing that I noticed about Kick-Ass the game was that it was seemingly an adaptation of both the film and the comic. The game literally opens with a clip from the film, but there are little comic strips pulled straight from the book on screen at certain points. The worst part about the game in general, though, is just how bad it looks. Like, the character models are absolutely grotesque. Textures are smeared everywhere, with definitive lines just wiping into other parts of the character model. The voice acting is also awful, most characters doing poor impressions of the actors they're trying to portray.
Check out the Mistmobile. Is that sweet or what?
And even outside of the intro, the game just sometimes plays clips literally ripped straight from the movie. But sometimes these clips are like displayed on a phone, on a table. What am I supposed to be watching here? Is this one of the characters in the game watching their own movie? Is this someone showing me, the player, a video of the movie on their phone? It's just very odd and lazy presentation all around. Kick-Ass the game is incredibly uninspired, and you might say that I should have expected less from a PSN downloadable game. But honestly, that's just a cop-out. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, was an incredibly inspired film tie-in game with an adaptation also based on a comic book. And that game was originally only released for digital download. The standard was there for the time, but the people behind Kick-Ass the game just weren't ready to put the time or the money into it to make it actually work. Magus is an action RPG developed by Axis Games. It was released on February 25th, 2014 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 32 out of 100 on Metacritic. Magus is kind of a cruel game, a game where you become a strangely wisecracking authoritarian filled with rage and immense power, a game that isn't aware of how funny it actually is because it isn't trying to be. Magus begins as our player character is rescued from his imprisonment on a floating island facility. He was captured there as a child and has been tortured for years. Our character is understandably angry, but is quickly told that he is essentially a very powerful and magical god. There are dialogue choices in Magus, but none of our choices really matter. The things we can say range from slightly odd to something only a maniacal all-powerful beast would say as he squashes an ant underneath his boot. The rage for his captors makes sense, but this rage quickly changes into an urge to subjugate just about everyone in this world and take control of it for himself. Why does this happen? Who knows? It's not like he wants to make any sort of justifiable change in the world. It's only because a woman showed up in his cell one day and told him that he was a divine being. He does flip-flop on this later in the game and decides that certain soldiers should be spared because they're just fighting for their kingdom, but then he just immediately goes back on this and starts killing them anyways. This game is almost incomprehensible. After playing it for about an hour, I still didn't really understand what I was even doing. All of the plot threads are incredibly flimsy. We go into an area by the water to massacre fish-like beasts for some reason, and we go into the desert to kill bandits. We're told that this area was where the gods and the Titans had a war, and that the Titans eventually disappeared somewhere. At least bad stories are bad. This game is just indecipherable. The dialogue feels like it was written in a linear fashion, as if someone sat down at a computer and jotted down the first words that came into their head and then called it a day. The voice acting doesn't help this either.
The gift from the gods. Each blessing is unique to each person. There's a good chance they would. Very well.
Wooden and stilted performances that lend absolutely nothing to any of the characters. As disjointed as the narrative is, the gameplay isn't much better. Magus is a fantasy action RPG, but the game plays more like Infamous than it does Skyrim. We mainly use magic powers to attack enemies instead of melee or ranged weapons. We have control of 3 types of magic. The developers of Magus, in their infinite wisdom, developed 3 completely unique disciplines: red, green, and blue. Yep, that's right, they couldn't even be bothered to create names for the types of magic that we use, just basic colors. We can fire basic shots with these colors, each of which have a different type of fire rate and damage. Each color also has an associated set of skills. The green skills can do things like summon walls of fire and slow down enemies. The blue skills can allow us to do things like teleport and run quickly. The red skills increase our damage and allow us to summon dead enemies. Every time we level up, we get a certain amount of skills that we can apply to various stats. Strength increases our damage, dexterity somehow increases our defense, and vitality increases our health. We can also equip weapons and items that will change these stats, adjusting them up or down based on what we're wearing. None of this really matters because the game is so easy that you almost never have to interface with any of these systems. Most enemies, even bosses, can be taken out with the standard weak attack. You rarely ever have to use any sort of mana or magic power. We can essentially just hold the R1 button to wipe all of the enemies out in front of us. It just takes a while sometimes. So if you don't really need to engage with the stats in the RPG, then is it really an RPG? The cherry on top is that the whole game just looks like garbage. The animations seem copy and pasted to every character. The protagonist walks around like a little goblin looking for some trash. Even the merfolk creatures have an animation that just looks a bit too human. All of the environments are bland, copy and pasted textures, just reused over and over again. Magus is definitely one of the worst games that I've played, if only talking about official large releases. It's almost purposeless, and slop of this level was kind of rare on consoles at this time. It seems like it would fit in more with something released on Steam today with store-bought assets and AI. There's nothing ambitious about it, seemingly no effort put in, and it certainly isn't fun. Vampire Reign Altered Species is a stealth action game developed by Artoon. It was released on September 2nd, 2008 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 30 out of 100 on Metacritic. Vampire Reign is extremely similar in style and gameplay to both Metal Gear Solid and Splinter Cell. In that way, it is extremely derivative, but in some ways, Vampire Reign actually endeared me to its loop and world. Vampire Reign is set in a world where, shocker, vampires exist. We control a special forces unit working for the American Information Bureau. The main character that we control is Lloyd, who's been sent to the streets of LA to carry out operations against the Nightwalkers. The game's cutscenes are very kitschy. Line delivery reeks of Japanese-developed games set in the West and released on the PS2.
That's what happens when you let pencil pushers run a country. They did absolutely nothing, while Nightwalkers claimed victims every night.
I heard about your family, sir. I'm sorry.
It's got a comfy atmosphere about it, even in a setting crawling with vampires and shadow-covered alleyways. Despite its atmosphere, it can actually be terrifying at times, with a soundtrack that is successful at generating a sort of stealth horror stew. The game controls much like Metal Gear or Splinter Cell. We stealth around areas, climb different environments, sneak around, and use objects to complete tasks. We can attack enemies by pulling up our weapon and pressing the fire button, but especially in the early game, killing enemies is damn near impossible. I would say this is probably the defining design choice that sets this game apart from others in its genre, both good and bad. If we're caught in an enemy's line of vision, we get a flash on the screen of 2 eyes. If we stick around, we'll be seen by the enemy and go into a caution state. They'll immediately rush to attack us. The first hit will take off 3/4 of our health bar, and we'll be stunned so that the second hit kills us. It's impossible to get away from this, to run away and hide like in other stealth games of the same style. Later in the game, it will become possible to kill enemies, but for now, if you're caught, you're dead. This was a big complaint with the game on release and its following difficulty, but I actually thought this was an interesting gameplay choice. It makes the enemies actually feel powerful for the first chunk of the game, and it sets it apart from the ones that preceded it. But the game is just way too damn hard. They were right. The game is really just trying to get you to play it the way that it wants you to. Try over and over again to look for a route that works, because all of the other ones are effectively dead ends. That being said, I don't want to heap too much praise on this game because it's far from perfect. The level design is a bit too linear. While each level is presented like there might be many methods that can be used to progress, there really is just one definitive way forward. Even though the levels are open, it leaves them feeling a bit linear and sometimes pretty empty. The story, while it can be charming, leaves a lot to be desired. It's certainly not as cerebral as something like Metal Gear Solid, and it isn't as intriguing as something like Splinter Cell. It's also pretty average as far as vampire games go. Not really a super interesting world here. The only unique trait the game has is its cross between the vampire genre and a special operations aesthetic. It's a bit clunky as well, and failing can leave you restarting from a checkpoint and having to wait for enemies to move around again so you can take a clear path through. Vampire Reign Altered Species is far from the worst game I've ever played. In fact, it's actually somewhere in the mid to decent range. It's certainly not deserving of its title as one of the worst games on the system. It has a certain charm about it that kept me going even after I had gotten enough footage and a good impression of it. It's not something that I'll return to time and time again, but it's certainly something to look into if you've exhausted other options. Escape Dead Island is an action-adventure game developed by Fat Shark. It was released on November 18th, 2014 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 40 out of 100 on Metacritic. Now, most of the games in this video I actually played on a PS3 emulator called RPCS3. But for some reason, I could not get usable footage from this emulator for Escape Dead Island. So the footage you're seeing here are recordings I got from the Steam version of the game. Escape Dead Island was actually the third game developed in the Dead Island series. The franchise began in 2011 with the release of the first title, and continued with Dead Island Riptide, a first-person spin-off set in the same world. Escape Dead Island would follow both of these games, but unlike the first two, would not be first-person and would shirk most of the gameplay hallmarks that the first two games introduced. The first game was known for its dismemberment system, its loot, variety of weapons, progression mechanics, and exciting combat. The game was essentially about cutting down zombies as much as you could and getting rare weapons that could complete that task in more efficient and flashy ways. Escape Dead Island essentially has none of that. There is no loot system, there are not weapons to really pick up outside of the standard ones that you're given at the beginning of the game. There's no progression or leveling up, you just get a standard character for the entirety of your playthrough. This is because Escape Dead Island is a completely separate spin-off to the series. That doesn't mean it's wholly bad though. In fact, I found some of what Escape presented fun and flashy in its own way, though the rest of what it holds is bland, poorly designed, and not at all what the appeal of Dead Island represents. The game puts us in the shoes first of someone infiltrating the corporation that developed the virus. This is just the prologue though, and we're quickly then switched to another main character, Cliff. Cliff and his two friends are about to infiltrate the island of Banoi to investigate and film the outbreak there. Most of what's been happening there has been cut off from the outside world, so they're heading in to do some investigative journalism. Things go quickly downhill when they lose their boat and are forced to survive and escape Dead Island. In the game, we can fight zombies with our main melee weapon. This is done by either making heavy or light attacks. These attacks deplete our stamina meter. Dodging does this as well, and ensuring that we still have enough stamina to run or fight is incredibly important. The biggest problem with this system is that it's just far too simple, and that enemies do so much damage. We can really only take a few hits before we're downed. The system almost ends up being like a Dark Souls style game where we need to dodge every hit and get in and out. One enemy will generally get stunned by our normal attacks enough that we kill it with a few hits. But more than one enemy requires precise weaving in and out of combat. If there happens to be a ranged enemy in the encounter, then you're just screwed. If you get hit really even twice by the ranged enemies, then you're just immediately dead. The game doesn't end up being difficult, just frustrating. There are items that we can collect to increase our max health, but these are usually extra items that we need to get from exploring further and finding secrets. We do get a pistol as well that is very powerful, but ammo for it is quite sparse. The game does have some decent motion comic style cutscenes that add a particular aesthetic to the story, but honestly, the concept of Escape Dead Island in general is just flawed. The allure of Dead Island was never about the story or the lore, at least for me. So creating a spin-off that decides to drill deep into the specificities of the outbreak and its origins isn't really that appealing. The appeal in the first place was the action combat system mixed with the RPG progression and loot. When you rip all of these systems out, you have something that might sort of feel like Dead Island, but doesn't really provide the player with anything that they came looking for. Rogue Warrior is a first-person shooter developed by Rebellion Developments. It was released on December 1st, 2009 for the Sony PlayStation 3 and has a 27 out of 100 on Metacritic. Steven Seagal Simulator 2009, Rogue Warrior, is less interesting than the story behind the game. The original game was meant to be a tactical FPS and was set in present-day North Korea. You would play Dick Marcinko, who was working with his team to disable the nuclear capabilities of the country. Some interesting features were planned for the multiplayer as well, like a custom map system that allowed players to design their area, and the game would then randomize the rest of the map. This game was somehow published by Bethesda Softworks and was originally developed by Zombie Studios. But after hiccups in development, the game was handed over to Rebellion Developments. The whole project was scrapped and they started over from zero. Rogue Warrior is sort of based on a book by Dick Marcinko released in 1992 by the same name. I say sort of because this book is autobiographical and the video game is obviously not. Dick Marcinko was a U.S. Navy SEAL commander and veteran of the Vietnam War. He commanded what was called the most successful SEAL operation in the southwestern region of Vietnam and eventually led a terrorist action team during the Iran hostage crisis of 1979. But since he created a best-selling book, Marcinko sort of became a public figure. He sold DVDs and VHSs recounting his Red Cell operations, had a conservative talk show called America on Watch, designed knives, wrote books on team building for business executives, taught Jim Carrey torture combating techniques to deal with the makeup process in How the Grinch Stole Christmas, defended Gitmo and Abu Ghraib, served as a consultant on the television show 24, and was indicted and eventually convicted for conspiracy to defraud the government and sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. Those things are all out of order, but Dick Marcinko is certainly an interesting fella. Rogue Warrior is an extension of the fictional version of himself that he created in the fictional novel follow-ups to the Rogue Warrior book. Rogue Warrior on its face is just a bland FPS. We play a Black Ops agent infiltrating a variety of different Soviet and North Korean military complexes to disable their munition supplies and missile launch capabilities. We shoot enemies, stealth kill them, take their weapons, take cover, and repel from buildings. But it's not the game or the concept itself that makes Rogue Warrior interesting. It's all the little details. Playing the game will make you understand the character of Dick Marcinko a little more, who is voiced by Mickey Rourke.
The brass running this op is a dip-dump desk jockey named Admiral Travis Payton.
Everywhere that Marcinko goes is a shithole. Everyone that gives Marcinko orders is a desk jockey. The men that Marcinko works with are hard, and he talks about his balls a lot.
Suck my balls, my hairy fucking big balls. Wrap them around your fucking mouth.
Dick Marcinko, the character at least, is the amplified example of a badass combat operative.
Commander, this is Peyton. What's your status?
It's a total goat fuck. Goddamn KPA were waiting for us. My men are dead.
Jesus Christ. Abort.
Fuck no.
It's almost parody how the interpretation is turned up not to 11, but fucking 100. It feels like the quintessential representation of the fantasy of every middle-aged American man with a kettlebell set in his finished basement. And I mean, the image is terrifying. Imagine you're a military officer and suddenly a man is invading your base, running at you with a gun, screaming about how hairy his balls are.
That's the factory. The great leader must have a tiny dick.
It would intimidate even the fiercest of soldiers. Rogue Warrior did get its fair share of chuckles out of me throughout its runtime, just for the sheer ridiculous amount of profanity that the protagonist constantly uses. But outside of that, Rogue Warrior creates a shield wall of bugs that prevent you from really accessing it. Passing this wall of bugs isn't really worth the effort for the campaign, with an incredibly short runtime and pretty vanilla combat encounters that didn't quite fit what the market was asking for. I could also not get this one to run on the PS3, but I also could barely get the PC version of the game to run. Once I did, it would still just minimize the window every few minutes or so, no matter what I did. I assume this was an extra challenge, baked into the game. Real soldiers can gun down their enemies blind. They don't need to see who they're fighting, scope out the battlefield, and take the shot. They can minimize their window and still get the job done. With that, we've talked about 8 of the worst reviewed games on the PS3. Let me know in the comments what the worst game you've played on the PS3 was. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to like it and subscribe, as that really helps me out. You can also find my Patreon in the description. Subscribing over there really helps support the channel, and you get access to some exclusive content and reviews I don't post anywhere else. I'll see you next time. Bye, Dad.